Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, a podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 220, The Analysis of Robert E. Lee. So last time we had a full episode, we ended our second of two episodes on Reconstruction. I think this one is one of those subjects that we might want to revisit in the future. Certainly, there are plenty of books and maybe even podcasts that are dedicated to just Reconstruction. So I know a two-part episode probably seems a little off-kilter, but I do think it is a good kind of snapshot of the end of the war and the end of our narrative episodes as well. This week, we're going to begin with one of the episode types I've planned for the show moving forward. I want to take a deeper dive on certain officers during the war, looking at their work as a whole. I think in our narratives, we attempted to do that occasionally, but I figured that one episode with everything collected will also be helpful. I think of no better place to start with that than Robert E. Lee. Of course, let's talk about some Patreon content, and we are going to be rolling out some new episodes here coming up. We have a memoir review on tap here for Jonathan Letterman, and if that name sounds like it's familiar, it would be the individual who is often credited with turning around the health of the Army. It has also coming up with a triage system in terms of medical care for battlefield casualties. So we do have that on tap. We've done some movie reviews in the past here. Most recently, we did Major Dundee, and that's going to be also posted as of the release of this recording. So if you want to hear about the historical accuracy of that movie, talk about some things, some themes that we saw, and if that sounds like it would interest you, whether that's the memoir reviews, we also have picture slideshows. I'm working on maybe coming up with an additional picture slideshow coming up here, maybe even going into a different lane of some lesser visited sites and kind of talking through those. And if that sounds like it would interest you, if any of that sounds like it would interest you, really, there's a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. So Robert E. Lee is often considered to be the best general of the war. And while there is a certain narrative associated with him in terms of the lost cause, I do tend to agree. He does more with less consistently during his time at the head of the Army of Northern Virginia. Unlike in some theaters of the war, once Lee has a real opportunity, he does not relinquish. But early, it actually was not a foregone conclusion that he would be elevated to the command that he obtains. In some ways, this is impressive. Like with other generals, I'm kind of interested to know the rise seemingly out of nowhere. Lee might have stayed in the backwaters of the war, but one artillery round is going to change the fate of the Confederacy at Fair Oaks. Was he invincible as the claims of the lost cause would throw out? No, he was not. It is commonly accepted that the South had better generals and that Lee was simply the recipient of bad luck with the resources available to him. While I do not subscribe to that opinion, I do have the opinion that Lee is still the best general for either side. The cult of personality that surrounded him is quite impressive. It is so large that I think there is nobody on either side that quite matches up to the stature. Even in his later days, there would be a reverence for Lee amongst the Army of Northern Virginia and their veterans, so there is something to be said there. But let's get some background on Lee first. Lee was going to be born at Stratford Hall in the Tidewater region of Virginia in 1807. His father was Light Horse Harry Lee, a veteran of the American Revolution. The older Lee had been assigned to a mixed cavalry infantry command known as Lee's Legion, and had performed well during the war. Specifically, we also may have mentioned, and it actually could be a subject that we visit here in a later episode, we've talked about some of the campaigns of the American Revolution, and at least mention some of these battles, you know, even going back as far as maybe some of our setup episodes, Lee does have a pretty big role to play in the campaign for Guilford Courthouse that eventually actually leads to Yorktown. So it leads toward the conclusion of the war, the victory of the fledgling United States against Great Britain. The elder Lee would go on to serve in the Congress of Confederation and then continue serving as a delegate in the Virginia General Assembly before being governor. He would seek to jump in on the War of 1812, but would be denied a commission, severely wounded in a moment of civil unrest in Baltimore during that same year. Light Horse Harry would remove himself to the West Indies for recovery, but would die upon his attempted return in 1818. Lee's determination for success, we can speculate, would come from his father's legend and probably also his post-revolution failures, at one point being sent to debtor's prison. His father and very early life do show that he is coming from a prestigious beginning. Even in Robert's marriage, we can see some of that, as he would marry Mary Anna Custis, who was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. So you can tell that his roots within the old elite are fairly strong. As such, you can see this in his demeanor throughout the war. Officers who don't keep their head are often cashiered from his ranks. Lee is also reluctant to criticize openly other officers, not wishing for embarrassing situations. We have read some of his statements on men such as Hood, and while it sounds very mild by today's standards, you can see the extent of him openly calling out somebody. Lee would benefit from this Southern gentleman type upbringing during the Mexican-American War. Winfield Scott would love to surround himself with junior officers with talent, especially if they were Southern. Lee was old by those standards for a captain, but would show his value, especially scouting on the approach to Mexico City during the latter stages of the war. We see that those who served with Scott versus those who served with Taylor would model themselves off those generals. Certainly, Lee does a very good job of modeling himself off Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott being the Southern gentleman, the kind of quintessential general. He's the highest ranking general. We've mentioned this before in our narrative episodes, but the highest ranking general so far in American history leading up to the Civil War. Lee would go on to serve in Texas. In the meantime, he had performed well as an engineer, mapping out the border between Ohio and Michigan and working on the previously mentioned Fort Pulaski. He would have a stop as the superintendent of the military academy at West Point. In many ways, this would be a fitting appointment, as during his time as a cadet, he famously would not receive any demerits. Although I have seen it thrown out there that the demerit system was such that it could be flexible, and you could actually, even though if you got a demerit, you could wipe the slate clean, so to speak, if you kind of were able to rectify in certain ways. So still impressive, and once again very fitting to have him return to New York. Lee would have 7 children, only one of which who does not survive him. George Washington Custis Lee was his oldest, an aide to Davis, and then serving in the field, most notably at Sailor's Creek. We haven't been too long since we talked about that battle here at the conclusion of the war. Mary Custis Lee, his eldest daughter, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, or Rooney, who served as a capable cavalry officer, Ann Carter Lee, who will die in 1863, Eleanor Agnes Lee, Robert Edward Jr., who will go on to serve on the staff of Rooney Lee, and Mildred Child Lee. The beginning of the war would see Lee at a crossroads like much of the rest of the nation and the state of Virginia specifically. He was offered command in the regular army. He would write, "The South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North, as you say. I feel the aggression and am willing to take every proper step for redress. It is the principle I contend for, not individual or private benefit. As an American citizen, I take pride in my country, her prosperity, and institutions, and would defend any state if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. I hope, therefore, that all constitutional means will be exhausted before there is a resort to force. Secession is nothing but revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation, and surrounded it with so many guards and securities, if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. It was intended for a perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble, and for the establishment of government, not a compact, which can only be dissolved by revolution, or the consent of all people in convention assembled. So we have a very interesting account here from Lee himself, talking about how it is going to be regrettable. He doesn't necessarily agree with secession. There's a lot of people that actually share that opinion, right? And there's a lot of people that actually point it out, and we talked about this in our conclusion episodes, our postscript episode as well, where there's a lot of people who kind of say, well, this is revolution. This is kind of different than just legally removing yourselves from the Union. So we see that pretty heavily here, where Lee is saying, well, yeah, this is definitely like a rebellion, right? You don't want to necessarily use that word. That's probably a little bit negative, but revolution sounds great. And there's a lot of people in the Confederacy who will treat it as such, right? Like, this is us trying to gain our second independence, the Second War of Independence. So there's a lot of rhetoric that's like that. There's a lot of ways in which the southern states will justify that. And certainly with Virginia, who probably would have been fine staying in the Union, right? Along with some of these other border states, it definitely has that kind of tone to it. You can kind of see it. Lee was going to be against secession and was convinced that slavery would eventually die out. Certainly, Virginia was probably one of the more progressive states in the Confederacy, moving more in the way of Maryland. Lee would not raise arms against his home state should they secede, so he would resign his commission. Early in the war, Lee would be sent to the western part of the state. He would not perform well at Cheat Mountain, a Union victory helping to secure the western part of the state for the Union. From there, he would be sent to the Low Country, building mostly coastal defenses. He would get his famous nickname of Granny Lee, as well as King of Spays here, as he had a mind to improve the defenses. Lee understood the importance of the works, but the Southern planting class were not used to this kind of labor, and remember, especially early in the war, it was deemed unmanly to hide behind them. Remember, we talked about, and this has been a while in the narrative episode, so not expecting you to really remember it as much, but we talked about Big Bethel. That's an early battle of the war, kind of in this sort of time frame, this stage of the war. So you have the instance where there is an earthwork involved. The Confederates do have an earthwork. It is an assault. And by our late war standards, this is really just a skirmish. It's really not a whole lot to write home about, but a lot of people are writing about it because it really was one of the first real battles of the war, where there were actually two sides that were engaged. And part of the criticism of the Confederates is that they were attacked and they had earthworks as part of that. So with this failure at Cheat Mountain, as well as the reports of what was going on the coast, it would have been easy for Lee to slide into obscurity. He could have done well as an advisor for, say, Jefferson Davis, right? But it was not really a foregone conclusion that he would be put back into the field necessarily, right? So you do have that, and Lee actually does a good job, and really kind of a unsung hero type job here for Lee of funneling troops into the armies, particularly the army of P.G.T. Beauregard, before the Battle of First Manassas. So he is constantly trying to get regiments up to him, so that way he has enough men, and eventually we have the combination with Joe Johnson to defeat Irvin McDowell there in the first major battle of the war. With Richmond threatened, though, in 1862, there would be a need for Lee to remain in the capital. A passionate speech would be noticed as he reportedly slams his fist on a table in front of the Confederate Assembly at the thought of Richmond being given up. Joe Johnson had sort of thrown this idea out there, and he'd even said he needed to change the front by dividing up the command. With Johnson wounded at Seven Pines, there would become a vacancy for the Southern Army. Now Davis has limited options. He has Samuel Cooper, someone with no battlefield experience, P.G.T. Beauregard, whom he had grown to despise, and had abandoned an army in Mississippi following the Battle of Shiloh. And then he has Lee, So, really, if you think about it, the decision was going to be relatively easy for him. I guess, too, he also has Gustavus Smith, who took over for Joe Johnson once he had been wounded. However, at the same time, you're probably not really thinking a whole lot of Gustavus Smith because he does have a meltdown and he has to resign from the army, so he's kind of off the table. Now, one of my interesting what-ifs is that what if Lee performs well enough at his command to be sent to the west, and then Johnson takes back over for the primary army in the main theater? This is more intriguing than it probably sounds. Johnson was defensive mostly, but not without his offensive capability. He might have employed the same tactics Lee runs out during the Overland Campaign of 1864. Lee has an aggressive nature and the ability to form up an army, which is what is necessary in the West, or the subtheater of the war. If Johnson is not invading Maryland, which in my opinion he does not do, Lee is definitely operating in Kentucky being aggressive. At the very least, if not Kentucky, he's probably operating within the limits of Tennessee. He's not allowing, at least not without a fight, he's not allowing the Union Army to get into Georgia. Now, timelines probably don't really add up here, but it's an interesting thought. Let's, though, look at the battlefield career that Lee throws out. We will start first by looking at the 7 days. Had the 7 days gone differently, Lee still might have found himself a footnote of the war. This is a sort of trial period, and the thinking is that once Joe Johnson has recovered, he's going to regain control of the army. Certainly, Johnson thinks that. Davis probably doesn't think that, really, but certainly Johnson has that idea. He still thinks that the Army of Northern Virginia is his product. He built up the army, and we actually can kind of see how he kind of has a point. It's kind of the same as McClellan. McClellan spends a long time training up the army. Joe Johnson spends a good amount of time in these early stages trying to make it into a good fighting force. And he does a pretty decent job, but, you also have Robert E. Lee who puts his stamp on things, so it's not quite the same as, like, Alexander the Great taking over his father's army, back there in ancient times. But you can see how Johnson might have a point, at least a small point. Lee shows, in my mind, the correct aggression to turn the tide outside of Richmond, and subsequently shows the Union that it was going to be a harder war. He has a plan at Beaver Dam Creek that might have worked, although Jackson is really going to let him down. We will cover Jackson next episode and talk about that. A.P. Hill is going to throw his command against well-entrenched Yankees, racking up some casualties. You can also probably throw out there that Lawrence O'Brien Branch, somebody you probably haven't heard in a while, certainly not since he was killed at Antietam here in the narrative episodes, but Lawrence O'Brien Branch also kind of lets the entire Confederacy down at Beaver Dam Creek as well. Lee will not give up on the plan to eliminate the isolated 5th Corps and attack again at Gaines's Mill. Desperate for a victory, he will throw the largest assault of Confederates during the war and break the Union lines. We do have another kind of learning on the fly situation with Gaines's Mill, I think, where Lee thinks that Fitz-John Porter is going to line up defensively at a certain point, and it's just not really going to line up that way. He actually takes a position that's going to be further back, so he might have actually had another kind of very similar idea as Mechanicsville, Beaver Dam Creek, where Jackson comes in on the flank or even comes in the rear, but it turns out just how Fitz-John Porter has refused his line, that A.P. Hill is going to run into him again. Jackson is going to probably not really sparkle at Gaines's Mill. He's going to start throwing his forces in piecemeal, and then finally when the rest of the Confederate forces arrive on the field, that's when you have this grand assault, and you have Hood making a good name for himself, whether it was his Texans or Cadmus Wilcox or D.H. Hill and one of his North Carolina regiments breaking through the Union lines first. You have, although higher in casualties than compared to the Union forces, you do have Lee's first victory of the war. The next days are going to involve a chase of McClellan. Jackson, again, is going to let Lee down at White Oak Swamp, and Glendale is going to be a huge missed opportunity. We'll probably cover Glendale in a future episode, but this is, remember, if you will, our narrative episode where we talked about how Glendale is going to be this crossroad, and it could have actually cut through McClellan's army, cut him off from the river. That's what McClellan's trying to do. He's trying to get back to the river. He's trying to get it into a situation where the gunboats can protect him, and then he can make his way back to Harrison's Landing, right? So that's kind of his big goal here. And with that goal, we have Malvern Hill, which would also be a decent plan, although I would actually classify Malvern Hill as probably the least sound tactically of these plans that he has in the 7 days. There's a lot of moving parts. It's kind of like Seven Pines. It's kind of like Shiloh, really, if you kind of compare those two battles. And Malvern Hill wasn't quite as big as Shiloh, let's say, but there was a lot of moving parts in those where it's going to be complicated for really any army to execute them here in this early stage of the war. Certainly by maybe 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia would have been able to execute it. And there's really no getting around the Union defense. They were in a very strong position. There's not really a whole lot of flanking that you can do. They have this idea of having the artillery kind of concentrate on Malvern Hill, and it doesn't really come to fruition. So you do have another costly tactical victory, I guess you could say, for McClellan. It's a Union victory, and then but then the Union Army is actually going to be removing itself from even further from Richmond. So you could say that it's also a victory for the Confederates in that regard. If anything, during these battles, Lee is going to learn that he needs to shake up the personnel, and the complex plans were probably going to be too much even for an army in 1862. Second Manassas is going to follow these 7 days, and it's going to be one of Lee's two great victories, and in my opinion, Second Manassas might be his greatest victory and the greatest opportunity for a Confederate army, certainly, to eliminate the primary Federal field army during the war. It's going to start with Jackson engaging some of the command of John Pope. He's going to overwhelm them at Cedar Mountain, and then Lee is going to have this idea of dividing up his army. And hold on to that thought, of course, as we get here later in the war. He's going to have this idea of dividing his army. Jackson is going to have a huge flank march, and it kind of gives us, and we'll probably cover this in a future episode, really, I feel like I'm jumping around everywhere, but John Pope, I think, does probably the worst out of any of these army leaders, if we will, in the main theater of the war, and he probably does the most to almost losing the war, right? That's probably a wild thing to say. You probably have heard before of Ambrose Burnside, being sort of incompetent, right, with your Fredericksburg, what have you, right? But I would actually argue that it's kind of the lowest rung on the totem pole would be John Pope if we're talking about Eastern Army commanders. Obviously lower than McClellan, lower than Hooker, right? Lower than Meade. So he does the best job of doing the worst, I guess we could say here. So there is a little bit of a disdain for John Pope and his capability. He's more of a political general anyway. He has Island Number 10. That's kind of his big victory there in the West. And he wasn't really facing too strong odds there. So he is commanding in the field. He, obviously rubs everyone the wrong way, including the Confederates, who he says, we're going to be harder on these civilians. Lee doesn't like that. There is going to be a disdain for him. Jackson's going to flank around. We use the thoroughfare gap up there and get around and into the rear of the Union Army. And it's kind of amazing how Pope just doesn't know where he is. He's got, almost 30,000 men, and he doesn't know where he is. And then we have what sparks a Second Manassas. So Jackson is going to engage the Union troops as they're marching by at the Bronner Farm. Then you have the next day, we have the railroad cut. And then on the third day, you have Longstreet's famous flanking march where he's going to start to try to roll up the Union forces. Might have actually jumped off the day prior, but remember we have Fitz-John Porter. So ironically, even though Fitz-John Porter is going to get court-martialed following this action, he does actually do a good job of stopping Longstreet from smashing into the flank before there's additional troops that are arriving onto the field for the Union Army. And before, if you're on the third day, you have the defense of Henry House Hill by certain units, and that's going to save the Federal Army from being completely annihilated. Now, Jackson doesn't press at Second Manassas. His troops are kind of spent, so he doesn't press. Longstreet's troops, especially with the Chin Ridge defense, are going to see their momentum kind of wane. So there's not going to be a whole lot of Confederate troops left. There's a little bit of a cavalry action, but there's not going to be a whole lot of troops left to really drive home the victory. But you get the idea. It was probably the closest anybody's going to come to eliminating an army, or at least inflicting the kind of loss that people say sometimes with First Manassas, and First Manassas is on the docket to go back over, but people say that the Confederate Army could have dealt a bigger blow to the Union forces following First Manassas. This is the kind of action, really, we should be looking at Second Manassas in that regard. Now, it's understandable that following Second Manassas, Lee is going to take his army into Maryland. But he's going to be operating with less than efficient strength from the heavy campaigning. 45,000 will be his army, outnumbered pretty heavily by McClellan. McClellan is also going to get a copy of the Confederate orders and strike at South Mountain, probably his finest hour. The two armies would then meet in nearby Sharpsburg, Lee turning in another good performance, being able to check the Federals in all three sectors of his command. Longstreet and artillery, as well as the timely arrival of A.P. Hill, would save his army of Northern Virginia. We have also, even prior to the battle, we actually have him posturing there at Antietam Creek, and he's allowing for additional reinforcements to arrive. So there is that as well in terms of a good job of him to stave off kind of this elimination. That's why I've kind of talked about it before. I'll talk about it probably in a future episode as well, where I think Antietam, the victory does belong to McClellan, but I think also there is an argument for it being a Confederate victory because the army doesn't get destroyed, because it is facing pretty long odds, and there is evidence to support that had things gone differently in certain areas, then it might have been a defeat. And if had it started actually earlier as well, it might have been a defeat where Lee's going to have a fighting retreat back into Virginia. At Fredericksburg, Lee is almost going to be outmaneuvered by Ambrose Burnside early in the campaign. He's going to capitalize on a good position in Marye's Heights and repulse a heavy assault by the Federals. Fredericksburg, though, is not without its flaws. Confederates, with the exception of those defending the stone wall, do not find cover and do suffer some casualties. It does kind of display, though, the fact that Lee is not really expecting Ambrose Burnside to get across the river at Fredericksburg and actually assault his position, because he doesn't really dig in a whole lot. None of his troops dig in. You have the stone wall, that's really the only defensive position in the main assault sector at Fredericksburg. So he thinks he's going to have to maneuver, so he doesn't dig in. A lot of the earthworks that you see there now are actually earthworks that were built after the battle and prior to the second battle, what we refer to as the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, as part of Chancellorsville. And here we get to Chancellorsville, speaking of that battle. Considered to be the greatest victory of Lee, he's going to once again divide his army. Not only is he going to do it once, but he's going to do it 3 times. We have Joseph Hooker, who's going to have a pretty good idea of getting around the Confederate forces, and he's going to try to get through the wilderness and out into the open plain where then he can campaign. You also have a combination of George Stoneman doing a cavalry raid, who does not perform particularly well, and then you also have Jackson being able to blunt the army as it tries to get out of the wilderness. Joseph Hooker is going to pull back into that defensive area, and then he's going to dig in. And actually, it's not necessarily a bad idea, right? Hooker realizes that he has kind of the advantage, so to speak, where if Lee is outnumbered, he's going to have to throw men at well-entrenched positions, which he actually does on the third day at Chancellorsville. And he's going to be able to hopefully repulse the Confederates and force them maybe to fight a battle more on his choosing. And remember, he also has this idea that Stoneman is going to be raiding into the supply lines, and Lee's going to have to withdraw, maybe back to, say, the North Anna River, which, he does withdraw back to there in the Overland Campaign. Even with the big victory, as Lee is able to divide up his army, Jackson goes on his famous flanking march. He's going to slam into the 11th Corps, and then he's going to try to actually push the Union Army further on that second day. He's going to be mortally wounded. It's going to be a huge loss for Lee. Lee's going to throw in a lot more men into an assault on the third day, and then you're going to have Cadamus Wilcox checking the other part of the Union forces who are going to storm over the Rappahannock River, and they're going to gain the heights that they had suffered pretty heavy casualties at during the first Battle of Fredericksburg. Those are guys going to be under Sedgwick, and then Sedgwick's going to be blunted by Cadamus Wilcox, who's going to show up at Salem Church and really save the day and really solidify the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville. So Lee does have an interesting, bold plan where he divides his army a couple of times. There are a couple things, as we just mentioned, that go right for him, and really you need a little bit of mix of that, right? You need to have a good plan. You need to have a good control over your army. You do need to have a little bit of luck as well. Now we get to Gettysburg. So Lee is going to have this golden opportunity, especially following Brandy Station, where he's going to be able to invade the North for a second time. He's really going to try to execute this better than he did at Antietam. He does get into Pennsylvania, and you do have the Union Army being under command of Meade, and we'll talk about Meade in a future episode. But just as we mentioned how things could potentially go right for you, right? You need to have these lucky instances, or, lucky might not be the right word, but you need to have these things go right for you on the battlefield. I think Gettysburg is an example of good tactical plans where some things just go wrong for Lee, right? You don't have the cavalry with you on the first day, even though the first day at Gettysburg is, the best day probably for the Confederates. You have this assault on the second day that almost works, right? He has this idea like Longstreet's going to attack. He's going to try to roll up the line. And there are certain instances, especially if we get into, like, say, Cemetery Hill, whether it's Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, where if just a little bit more might have actually broken the Union line. Hard to say exactly what happens after that, but might have forced Meade to withdraw to a different position, and then you only have Gettysburg as a 2-day battle, and it's a Confederate victory, and maybe Lee is able to winter up there in a northern state. And then you have, of course, Pickett's Charge, which, as we pointed out in our narrative episodes, we talked about this before, where Pickett's Charge necessarily wasn't the worst call in the world, right? It does have kind of an execution flaw a little bit, though, I would say, with not having any forces to follow up on the breakthrough that happens. And then you have Stuart's cavalry action. There really comes to nothing there, and Gettysburg is over. So then you have Lee escaping once again back into Virginia. He has to retreat. He gets trapped at one point by Meade. Meade is not able to hold him, so he's able to get back to Virginia, get back to friendly lines. We have a couple of campaigns going on in there, whether it's the Bristow Station or Mine Run campaign as well. And but you can kind of chalk those up to Meade's not really going to be the best to really drive home these offensive victories necessarily. And we have kind of a return to the status quo, at least to a degree, here in Virginia prior to 1864. So with the Overland Campaign, we have the longest odds now for Lee. He needs to take out Ulysses S. Grant, who's come to lead the Federal armies. The Wilderness, I think we can kind of look at that battle as a missed opportunity once again. Could have gone very differently. It's really the last battle where Lee is going to be able to act offensively. It's a close run thing, and there's urgency in Lee in trying to get his troops to the right position. We look at the Widow Trap Farm, and he's going to try to lead troops into combat because he understands just how dire the situation is. Texas Brigade tells him to go back, right? Famously, here there at the Wilderness. But we have a situation where, hey, maybe if you have Gordon's flank attack that goes a little bit differently, it's supported a little bit better by the subordinate officers. And that's really one of the things that I think we need to drive home, is that Lee does have these good tactical decisions, and he's not without his mistakes, but I think really by this stage in the war, there's just been so much attrition in your officer ranks where you're just losing the individuals who really you're able to trust, whether that's Longstreet, Jackson is gone, right? A.P. Hill is kind of hit or miss. Dick Ewell is not going to be the guy that you want to act independently. He's really going to have to be supervised. So certainly Wilderness is another big thing that comes out of that battle, is that Longstreet is pretty severely wounded, and very interestingly, in a similar fashion to Jackson. And you're also pretty close to Chancellorsville as well. So kind of ironic that this happens. And you're without your two best subordinates. You get to Spotsylvania, right? Once again, Lee is going to be desperate to try to stave off the destruction of his army with the breakthrough there, right? We had our Emory-Upton assault. That's going to take part of the Muleshoe away. And then we have an additional assault there at the angle that is going to rack up some pretty heavy casualties. But really, it's also going to show how Lee is able to pick a good defensive position with the exception of this mule shoe that's kind of jutting out in the line, and it creates this opportunity for the Union forces. They're not able to capitalize, though, which I think is also a big part of the Battle of Spotsylvania, right? So Lee is able to filter troops where he needs them, and even though there's a huge loss in terms of men captured, especially in the Confederate Second Corps, we have a battle where if it had been another general officer leading the Union forces, if it had not been Grant, then maybe there would have been a withdrawal back closer into Washington, right? This leads us to North Anna, and at North Anna, it is going to be kind of a battle of missed opportunities that really highlights just how the subordinates are going to let Lee down. Lee is not feeling well at this point. He's ill, and he's going to let two opportunities slip through his fingers. The first is going to be elimination of the 5th Union 5th Corps there at Pickett's Mill. Had there been more troops over there, it was actually almost a huge disaster as it was for the Union forces, for there not being a whole lot of casualties, but they're just caught on the wrong side of the river, and had there been a more concentrated effort to try to trap and eliminate them, that could have been a huge setback for the Overland Campaign just in general. Then you also have Hancock and the 2nd Corps, who do essentially the same thing there, where they're going to get across the river. They're going to feel out the Confederate works, and they're in a position where, had there been a counterattack, it might not have gone well for the 2nd Corps either. So you have individuals who, once again, I hate to keep harping on it, but if you had Jackson's really understanding, he's on the same page that Lee is. Longstreet is able to act offensively in certain situations where he's given limited control, whereas Lee is going to have to try to control everything, and he just can't do that toward the end of the war. When we get to Petersburg, there is not really a whole lot for Lee to do. Famously, he's going to remark that if Grant is allowed to cross the James River and threaten the city, then it's going to be essentially over. Maybe hindsight, maybe not, but he is proved to be correct. Lee is going to spend the last few months of the war checking Grant on both flanks. And at this point, really, there's not going to be any reinforcements coming for Lee. He's kind of exhausted all those. The last kind of bottom-of-the-barrel reinforcements have come to him during the Overland Campaign, so it's really just going to be delaying the inevitable. Now, that being said, he actually does a pretty good job of continuing to try to check Grant as he's trying to get around the Confederate right and the Confederate left. Eventually, though, it just proves to be too much. Once the breakthrough happens, there is a little hope of Lee escaping, although things really were going toward a foregone conclusion. Lee is going to surrender at Appomattox, his army being allowed to go home. Grant had bested Lee at long last, effectively ending the war. After the war, Lee's not going to be arrested or reprimanded. We read in the narrative his appeal to Davis and his attitude toward the Confederate surrender. For a time, he would stay in Richmond before becoming the president of Washington Lee University. During the post-war years, Lee would be a voice for the Southern people to acclimate back into the fold of the United States and accept emancipation. While he did not agree with voting rights for the formerly enslaved, he did agree with Reconstruction plans in general. He would suffer a stroke in 1870 and pass away at the age of 63 on October 12th. In some ways, it is amazing when you learn just how old Lee was. While not the youngest general, some of the pictures you see of Lee later in the war make him seem like maybe he was in his 70s or his 80s even. Obviously, there's a lot of stress and pressure serving for the Confederacy, and many speculate that his time as Army commander of the Army of Northern Virginia are going to eventually lead to his death and stroke in 1870. What exactly do we make, though, of Robert E. Lee? And why is he probably the best general in the Civil War? Lee has several characteristics that make him a good Army leader. For one, he surrounds himself with the right subordinates. And you could also kind of have a caveat on that, where you say he is allowed to actually curate his officer corps to the degree that it becomes, let's say in late 1862, early 1863, where it becomes a very effective fighting force. You only have to look at John Bacon Magruder to see that if you do not perform well, or at least you do not perform to the degree that Lee wants you to perform, you're going to get the boot. In terms of his battlefield performances, he takes the right amount of necessary risk for success, in my opinion. Even when facing the long odds in most of his battles, he is able to take the right amount of chances. Many generals throughout the Civil War do not take any chances at all. We have plenty of examples of that, and it leads to mixed results. The offensive-defensive is truly a masterclass for Lee. In many cases, he uses interior lines to great effect, one of the prevailing thoughts on tactics of the day. Antietam might be one of the best examples of this, as Lee is able to shuffle his forces around. On kind of the flip side of that, you also have Petersburg, where as the lines become more and more stretched, he's less likely to do that. He's less able to do that. So even though he does a good job of shuffling forces when he needs them, we looked at some of these smaller engagements, like, say, first and second deep bottom. We looked at some of the engagements where it seems like Billy Mahone is constantly coming out of the woods and popping the fifth corps in the mouth, let's say, and then they're retreating. All of a sudden, Ream Station comes to mind, where you have the ability to kind of move troops to where they are needed in these certain sectors, and they're able to mitigate the kind of losses that you might have otherwise seen with a more concentrated federal effort on your isolated forces. The Army of Northern Virginia is made into one of the best fighting forces of the war, and the troops' devotion to Lee is something that adds to his overall success. In some ways, I think that if you take the 1863 Army and drop it into 1862, at the 7 days, despite lessened strength, you'll see a vastly different result. This is another big what if, but one that I find interesting nonetheless. And it's one of the things that you can go back to and point at, where you're saying, well, Johnson has this idea that he built up the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, Lee really makes it what it is. You also have this strained cult of personality that we talked about as well when it comes to Robert E. Lee, right? When Appomattox happens, he's kind of hanging out under a tree and people are taking parts of the tree because, he's there talking about the surrender or what have you, right? You don't see that with other generals during the war. And I'm not even saying this in terms of your lost cause of what happens after the war, but I'm saying during the war, there is definitely this affinity to Lee that's just different than other officers, right? You see Grant have kind of this flip side, during the Overland campaign, everyone's really excited when he shows up, and they're excited that he's continuing on to Richmond, but by the time you get to Petersburg, there's a lot of negative press for him because he's racking up all these casualties, whereas we have Robert E. Lee, who people are still going to have their morale fairly high as long as he's at the helm, right? And you just don't see that. And that ability, I think, is kind of an intangible that you really can't put a measure on, right? Where, and we'll talk about this when we get to Thomas Jackson here next episode, but we will have kind of this unmeasurable metric when it comes to certain generals of the ability to actually increase morale, inspire your troops. I remember, when we're talking about, say, like a Total War video game where you're able to use your generals to kind of inspire troops and prevent them from breaking, make them fight better, right? In certain types of that game, you can do that, and I think certainly Lee is going to be our great case in point of example of somebody who's going to have that ability here during the American Civil War. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end our episode there. This week we took a much deeper dive on the complete work of Robert E. Lee as a general. I think this is helpful to analyzing him further as potentially the best general of the war. Next episode, we're going to perform a similar exercise. This time, though, we're going to take a look at Thomas Stonewall Jackson. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.